provide a little bit more lumber within their supply. But there's no way that they can replace the imports coming from Canada.
Well over 35%. I think Americans are going to be finding out very shortly the impact that these duties are going to be having on
Canadian export. The U.S. Commerce Department is hiking anti-dumping duties on Canadian softwood lumber to 20.56%.
The silence inside the mill was unbearable. Machines that once roared with life stood frozen. Workers, 300 of them, were sent home in a single night. Not because demand collapsed, not because lumber was suddenly useless, but because $3 billion worth of Ontario softwood lumber shipments to the United States were cut off overnight. In small American towns, fathers walked back from shuttered gates carrying their helmets instead of paychecks. 300 U.S. factories, from furniture plants in Michigan to paper mills in Wisconsin, went idle at the same time. Whole neighborhoods stared at dark smokestacks, wondering how quickly hope can vanish when trade turns hostile. At the ports, trucks lined up with nowhere to unload, rail yards backed up with empty cars, and in housing markets across America, panic began. Builders called suppliers, begging for shipments, but the answer was the same. Ontario lumber is not coming. Ashen, the images were heartbreaking. Empty factory floors, families wondering how to cover mortgages without steady work. And just across the border, cargo ships loaded with Canadian lumber sailed out of Halifax and Thunder Bay, not to America, but to Rotterdam and Hamburg. Canada's message was clear. The U.S. would no longer be the first customer. Why? Why did America, once the dominant lumber power in North America, suddenly lose its lifeline? Why did Ontario, a region that supplied the bulk of U.S. demand, slam the door shut on its neighbor? The answer lies in a bitter trade war, one ignited by Washington itself. A war of tariffs, retaliation, and contracts rewritten in the span of weeks. This is the story of how the United States went from trusted buyer to abandoned partner, and how Canada seized the moment, diverting its lumber to new buyers in Europe and Asia. For decades, the United States relied on one partner above all others for its lumber, Canada. From Ontario's vast forests came the softwood planks that built American suburbs, framed houses, and filled shelves in Home Depot stores nationwide. This cross-border partnership was more than commerce, it was tradition. Every year, billions of dollars in Canadian lumber flowed south, while American factories kept humming with steady supply. In the 1992nd and 2002nd, U.S. lumber mills had already begun to struggle with rising costs and shrinking forest acreage. But the shortfall was masked because Ontario, British Columbia, and Quebec stepped in. By 2020, over 1/3 of all U.S. softwood lumber demand was covered by Canadian imports. For furniture plants in Ohio or paper mills in Minnesota, Ontario shipments were as reliable as electricity, always on, always there. This dependency grew quietly. Buyers signed long-term contracts. Shipping lanes were built around the assumption that Canada would never say no. And for a time, it seemed unshakable. American builders even called Canadian wood the invisible backbone of U.S. housing. But in trade, history does not guarantee the future. As Washington shifted toward protectionist policies, Canada began to question the balance. Friction rose with each tariff dispute, each accusation of unfair pricing. Still, U.S. buyers believed Canada needed them too much to ever walk away. That confidence shattered in June 2025. Contracts were torn up. $3 billion in supply was redirected in a matter of days. Buyers in Europe and Asia signed deals almost instantly, while U.S. factories watched their pipeline vanish. A market once held together by trust and habit collapsed under the weight of politics. The U.S. had once been the first customer. Now, it was left outside the gate. The collapse did not happen by accident. It was the result of one deliberate decision in Washington: a new tariff. In June 2025, the U.S. government imposed a 20% duty on Canadian softwood lumber. Officials framed it as protection, an attempt to shield domestic mills from what they called unfair competition. But the numbers tell another story. Canadian producers had long supplied 1/3 of U.S. demand at stable prices. American mills could not fill that gap, no matter the tariff. And buyers, home builders, furniture makers, paper plants would inevitably pay more. Canada's response was swift, and it carried a name that sounded like an iron fist: the Softwood Lumber Retaliation Act of 2025. Ontario, holding some of the richest timberlands in North America, announced a suspension of all exports to the United States. Not a slowdown, not a renegotiation, a total halt. Overnight, $3 billion in contracts were nullified. The consequences spread like wildfire. Lumber that was destined for U.S. factories was rerouted to Europe. Within days, new tariff-free contracts were signed with buyers in Germany, the Netherlands, and Poland. Ships that once pointed south toward New York or Baltimore shifted east to Rotterdam. Canadian officials described it as diversification. In truth, it was retaliation with precision. Secondary forces sharpened the blow. Logistics costs had been rising inside the U.S. Higher diesel prices, congested rail lines, and labor shortages in trucking. Ontario exporters faced fewer of these headaches when serving European markets, thanks to efficient Atlantic shipping route. On top of that, European buyers offered predictability, long-term contracts, no tariffs, and standardized quality checks. For Canadian producers, it was easier and more profitable to pivot than to fight U.S. bureaucracy. Meanwhile, American factory owners gave testimony that sounded almost like pleas. A furniture plant manager in Michigan told local media, "We built our entire production line around Canadian lumber specs. Switching is not as easy as calling another supplier. We can't run with thin air." Even U.S. farmers in forestry-dependent counties felt the squeeze. With mills idled, demand for locally harvested wood plummeted. Loggers left equipment rusting in the fields, unsure if contracts would ever return. And still, officials in Washington defended the tariff. They argued it was necessary to give domestic producers a chance to grow, but growth cannot happen overnight, and the global market does not wait. Buyers in Europe were happy to sign 10-year deals with Canada, while U.S. mills scrambled to adjust. The main cause was clear: a tariff that backfired. The secondary cause was equally fatal. Canada had options, and the world was ready to buy. The United States had triggered a trade war. Canada had already won the first battle. While the United States stumbled under its own tariff, Canada moved with discipline and speed. Ontario officials framed it not as punishment, but as realignment. In practice, it was a show of strength demonstrating how a nation with deep resources and steady policy could seize the global stage. Canada's edge began with dominance in production. The country remains the world's second largest exporter of softwood lumber, with Ontario alone accounting for a massive share. Decades of investment in sustainable forestry meant Canadian mills could ramp up supply without depleting resources. When Washington imposed its tariff, Ottawa and provincial leaders knew they could redirect output almost instantly. The second advantage was trade policy. While U.S. negotiators were busy erecting barriers, Canadian diplomats were signing new doors open. In early 2025, Canada finalized a tariff-free lumber pact with the European Union. That single agreement gave Canadian exporters access to markets worth billions, at precisely the moment U.S. buyers were shut out. For Rotterdam importers, it was a windfall: fresh supply, predictable costs, and long-term contracts secured within weeks. Logistics was another battlefield where Canada held superiority. Ports like Halifax and Montreal had already been upgraded with modern terminals and digitized customs clearance. Shipping lines could load lumber in bulk and deliver to Europe in less than 2 weeks. Compare that to U.S. ports struggling with congestion, where containers sometimes waited days just to be processed. Efficiency meant reliability, and reliability meant trust. On the production floor, Canadian mills showcased not only volume, but quality. Automated cutting systems, advanced drying kilns, and strict grading standards ensured that every shipment met European codes without delay. Buyers in Germany praised the consistency, noting that Canadian wood arrives ready for construction. No surprises, no excuses. Government-industry cooperation made all of this possible. Ottawa provided export financing guarantees, provincial leaders streamlined paperwork, and industry groups coordinated marketing campaigns across Europe and Asia. The message was unified. Canada was the stable partner in a volatile world. The results came quickly. Major contracts shifted overnight. German wholesalers signed 5-year supply agreements worth hundreds of millions. Dutch buyers filled their warehouses with Canadian shipments. Even Asian markets, from South Korea to Japan, increased orders, sensing that Canada's redirected supply was an opportunity too good to miss. Meanwhile, Canadian media showed images that contrasted sharply with those south of the border. In the US, factory lights were dark. In Canada, cargo ships stacked with timber departed one after another, banners reading, "Bound for Europe." It was more than trade, it was symbolism. Canada was not just a supplier. It was a winner in the battle for global market trust. While the US clung to tariffs, Canada embraced contracts. While American mills stood idle, Canadian mills worked double shifts. And while Washington debated policy, Ontario delivered planks to European builders who would remember exactly who stood by them in 2025. The lumber war had created casualties, but it had also crowned a champion. Canada wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. The silence that spread across America's lumber belt in June 2025 was not just economic, it was social, human, and deeply painful. In Michigan, a furniture factory that had employed generations of families closed its gates. The owner said bluntly, "We depended on Ontario for 70% of our raw material. Without it, we can't operate." Overnight, more than 600 workers were laid off. Some wept in parking lots, others drove home in stunned silence, already calculating which bills they could no longer pay. In Wisconsin, paper mills that once churned out reams of office supplies and packaging slowed to a crawl. Managers tried to stretch the last piles of Canadian softwood pulp, but within days, machines stopped. Hundreds more jobs evaporated. Local diners that thrived on mill traffic saw empty booths. Communities that revolved around the hum of industry now listened to nothing but uncertainty. The domino effect stretched far beyond the factory gates. Trucking companies that once hauled lumber across the Midwest saw contracts canceled. Rail operators mothballed cars. Even small towns where loggers sold raw timber to mills were hit hard. With no buyers, prices collapsed, and logging crews simply stayed home. Housing markets felt the pressure too. Contractors in Texas, Florida, and California reported skyrocketing lumber prices as supply dwindled. Home buyers already stretched by high interest rates now faced another blow: rising costs for construction. What had started as a tariff battle at the border was now rippling through to families trying to buy their first home. The social impact was raw. In factory towns, families put houses up for sale. Young workers, unable to find steady paychecks, began leaving for cities or different states. Churches and community groups reported more requests for food assistance. A father in Ohio told reporters, "I've done this work all my life. Now my son is asking if he should leave town. I don't have an answer." The pain was amplified by the sight of Canada's success. American workers could watch the news and see Canadian cargo ships leaving full, bound for Europe. They could see the contracts announced in Berlin, in Paris, in Warsaw. And they knew that every ton shipped east was a ton not coming south. For the United States, the ripple effects were not only economic losses. They were a blow to pride, to stability, to the very sense of security in towns built on wood and steel. In global trade, price is important, but trust is everything. For decades, American buyers believed they could count on Ontario lumber without question. The wood was consistent, the shipments punctual, the contracts honored. Yet in 2025, that chain of trust snapped not because Canada failed to deliver, but because Washington's policy made delivery impossible. International buyers watched these moves carefully. When the US slapped on a 20% tariff, Canada did not stumble. It pivoted. The message to the world was unmistakable. Canada was willing to protect its industry, but also capable of finding new partners overnight. Europe took note. For German and Dutch buyers, the key factor was not simply cost per cubic meter of lumber. It was predictability. Could they sign a 10-year contract and trust shipments would arrive on time, tariff-free, and without political drama? With Canada, the answer was yes. With the US, the answer was no. Trust, once lost, is hard to win back. Ontario's suspension of exports under the Softwood Lumber Retaliation Act of 2025 showed buyers that one policy decision in Washington could unravel decades of cooperation. Even if tariffs are later reduced, the scar remains. Buyers ask themselves, if I gamble on the US again, will I be burned twice? Reliability is not about who has the biggest forests or the lowest costs. It's about who honors contracts without hesitation. And in 2025, Canada positioned itself as the steady hand, while America looked unpredictable. In a world where supply chains stretch across oceans, stability is as valuable as the product itself. Canada delivered stability. The United States delivered doubt. And in global trade, doubt is the quickest path to being replaced. The story of June 2025 is not just about lumber. It is about what happens when trade policy collides with reality. The United States believed a tariff would protect its mills. Instead, it triggered a collapse. 300 factories idle, $3 billion in contracts gone. Families left without work. Entire towns shaken, not because the product was bad, not because demand had fallen, but because trust in the flow of trade was broken. Canada, meanwhile, showed the world what resilience looks like. Cargo ships sailed full. New contracts were signed across Europe and Asia. Canadian officials proved that stability, predictability, and readiness to adapt can turn a crisis into opportunity. The lesson is clear. In global trade, it is never enough to produce. The real power lies in delivering on time, in full, every time. One wrong policy, one tariff too many, and decades of trust can vanish overnight. For the US, the warning is stark. If Washington does not adapt, if it cannot rebuild confidence in its trade commitments, then this rejection will not be the last. Other industries, from agriculture to steel, could face the same fate. So the question remains, can America win back this market, or is it gone for good?